Hey folks, welcome back. Heroscape is great and all, but sometimes you have no one to play it with when you want to. That's a situation I often find myself in, so I end up playing a lot of Soloscape. Today, I wanted to walk you through what it looks like and how a solitaire experience differs from playing against an opponent. Others before me have developed comprehensive rule sets for playing the game alone. I'll link to the most prominent ones I found on the forums in the video description. My take, however, is simply that these systems aren't for me. Roaming pods of enemies, charts to determine enemy behavior, and so on, While I encourage you to check them out for yourself to make your own determination, my opinion is that they add an additional layer of complication to the game that just doesn't interest me. You may find them to be just the thing you're looking for though, so I thought I'd mention them here regardless. When I play alone, I prefer to play Heroscape just the way it is, albeit with one slug controlling both players. This casually allows me to better test army builds or map designs at my leisure. To that end, here are some of the strategies I've picked up over the years on playing solo. The first one involves army drafting. I used to try to draft both armies from the ground up on the spot, but I often found this took a considerable amount of time to do. It also frequently left me with armies that I didn't want to play anyways, as I drafted and counter-drafted my way into a corner. The results were uncohesive rock, paper, scissors matchups that weren't any fun to play. Nowadays, I've altered my approach. I start by building an army for player 1 that I do want to play. Maybe it's a potential build I want to try at a local event, or maybe it's an army that includes a figure that normally doesn't see play, or both. Besides giving me something cohesive to look forward to playing, this also significantly cuts down on the time spent at the table just skimming through army cards, drafting, and counter-drafting. Now I can come up with an army at any point in my day, or test one that I read about online. After building the first army, I counter-draft an opposing force. Before I do, I decide whether to construct a hard counter, soft counter, or non-counter army. A hard counter army contains figures chosen specifically to defeat player 1's forces. This could truly test the mettle of player 1's build, or represent a worst-case scenario matchup at a local event. A hard counter army would be favored to win the battle. A soft counter army contains a few figures that might pose challenging for player 1 to defeat, but otherwise should represent a fair fight. This can be done by taking community power rankings or delta recosting into account when creating both armies. B-tier armies should fight other B-tier armies, for example. Some figures are just inherently weaker than others, and that needs to be considered when designing fairer matchups. A non-counter army contains no answer for player 1's forces and should be a cakewalk to roll over. I don't know, sometimes it's just fun to go on a one-sided tear, especially if there's no human being on the receiving end of the blowout. You'll be playing a lot more Soloscape than you bargained for if you steamroll your friends too many times. Once the armies have been assembled on the map, you'll want to position all of the cards and order markers facing you. Since you're playing against yourself, there's no need for subterfuge. You won't need the decoy markers unless you've drafted a figure like Glenerva, who has an ability linked to it. From here, play proceeds normally. Try to make the best decisions for each player, acting as you would in their situation. I think every individual has different tendencies when playing solo, so you'll want to become aware of your own. For me, I can't help but subconsciously root for one of the teams to win, even if I try to make the fight as even as possible. These aren't nondescript cardboard squares with stats on them. These are figures with personality, and I think that's an important part of the game to recognize. If you've heard me talk about LEGO before, it won't surprise you to hear that I place a lot of significance on the aesthetics of Heroscape. This probably explains why I don't use many D&D figures in my armies, despite owning them all. I can't seem to get past how utterly inconsistent their sculpt and paint quality is, not to mention that the molds themselves were not created for Heroscape initially. The same can actually be said for Valhalla custom figures, come to think of it. Some of them fit the aesthetics alright, and others, well, I think they look awful, and I don't want to play an army with figures that look awful, no matter how mechanically sound they might be. Aesthetically, my preferences lie with Classicscape. Age of Annihilation comes in a close second, with notable improvements to the detail of the molds, albeit with some occasional spotty paintwork. And D&D and Valhalla custom figures come in a distant third place. How did I get on this topic? Oh, right, player tendencies. Well, I guess I tend to favor armies that look cool over armies that don't. If you're playing against yourself in a solo environment, I feel that it's natural to root for the team that has your favorite figures in it. I don't care how much synergy player 1's army has. If player 2 is rocking Moorsbane, then I'm cheering for them, no questions asked. To try to desperately get this video back on track, let me offer a couple more suggestions on how to improve the Soloscape experience. Both of these strategies revolve around the dice. Since you'll be rolling for both players anyways, it would behoove you to expedite the process as much as possible. It might seem insignificant, but colored D20s assigned to each player can allow you to roll both initiatives at once. Greater still is my next piece of advice. Use the colored attack and defense dice from the first edition Rise of the Valkyrie Master Set. See, the original release of the game actually came with separate dice for attacking and defending. Eventually, some bean counter realized that they could just print both skulls and shields on one die and produce half as many of them. The rest is history. Even though they haven't produced these dice for over 20 years, I still highly recommend tracking down a set, as they alone make solo play significantly more enjoyable. Rolling dice for both players simultaneously can cut down the tedium and game length immensely, and this shouldn't be underestimated. Plus, as an added bonus, I find the colored dice are easier to visually determine how many skulls and shields were rolled at a glance. If Renegade Game Studios ever releases a separate dice kit for Heroscape, I hope they also consider printing a set of the first edition attack and defense dice, as they still have some utility that the modern versions can't quite replicate. I think that's all I have to say on the topic of Soloscape. To summarize, first, assemble one army completely, then counterdraft it using either a hard counter, soft counter, or non-counter approach. Recognize and play into or against your own tendencies as a player, solo or otherwise. Streamline the rolling process by using colored dice, so you can roll initiative, attack, and defense simultaneously as needed. That's it! I hope some of this has been useful to you. As always, I've been your host, R.R. Slugger, and until next time, happy scaping.